good, lovingly caring for weak and fearful and not so bright sheep. And elders were to oversee, to look over the flock, to see danger and to keep them safe, and to protect the sheep at all costs. And we praise God that Jesus is the chief shepherd who never fails. Yes, we human shepherds do, but not Christ. And He is the good shepherd. He lays down His life for the sheep. Jesus was not a hireling. He was not an employee looking over someone else's flock. But we're told Jesus was willing to die for the sheep to make them His very own. So God used the powerful image of shepherd and his sheep to call elders to a humble, sacrificial service to God's people. And in response to this, God's people were called to humbly respond to submissive leadership like these elders, so that the church of Christ would be built up, unified, and working together for the sake of the gospel. And the only way elder and church work together and we're unified is when humility is working among the people of God. So it's no surprise that as Peter went on in this letter, he writes, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you. And so the main point of this passage is clearly humility, that it is essential to the Christian life. For humility is mentioned 3 times here in verses 5 and 6. It's implied once. And so we need to understand humility is a mark of being a Christian. And within these 3 verses, we see 4 very clear incentives for us to be humble people. In verse 5, we hear God opposes the proud. In verse 5, we hear God gives grace to the humble. In verse 6, God will exalt the humble at the proper time by His mighty hand. And then in verse 7, God will use His mighty hand to care for His people who are living in humility. So we need to give some thought today to what pride is, what humility is, and we need to consider how humility works to keep us from being overcome by anxiety and fear. In the larger context of our letter, we need to remind ourselves that the churches to whom Peter was writing to, they were enduring fiery trials. And at the very end of chapter 4, we saw the words, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Now, these churches and these Christians were facing social and economic persecution because they were following Jesus. From a human perspective, it was unfair. It's unjust. But from the perspective of heaven, Peter tells us their suffering was the will of God. It was not meaningless. It was under the sovereignty of God's direction. And these Christians, they were indeed taught to understand that as they suffered, they were sharing in the suffering of Jesus. And on the great day when the Lord comes back, He is going to reward His people. He is going to make all things that are wrong right. But the fallen flesh and the enemy are always close by to tempt Christians to respond to the injustices of our life and the persecutions. And there's temptation to respond with anger and pride and rebellion. And so we can imagine if these people, they lost their jobs because they were following Jesus and couldn't pay their bills. These believers needed help. They needed incentives to remain humble in their fiery trials, to entrust themselves to God's care. Not only did they face persecution from the state, which is something that we're seeing now in our age, many of these Christians would have been slaves with uncaring masters. Many of them had unbelieving spouses that certainly were working against them, and difficult children. And in every normal day living, they were facing frustrations like we all face today. And in their frustrations at work and in marriage and parenting, when resources were low, emotions are high because they couldn't make ends meet, there was a temptation in all of that to throw off the clothing of humility and put on the clothing meant for battle and war, to complain, to fuss, to be jealous, and to live in unbelief and doubt God's goodness. Perhaps they'd come to church with burdens and cares, maybe a bad week, and maybe their church family was not ministering to them like they needed. The Christian church can become prideful instead of being humble. I think of the church in Ephesus. and your flocks